these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, folks. Pushing out another podcast in short order here because, I think it's important to talk about this issue with Israel and Palestine and, peace in the Middle East. And this is just a situation that infatuates the world. There's almost a romanticism to it. It's so long-standing. There's so much history to it. It's so complex. And despite that complexity, it seems very easy for people who know very little about the situation to take very strong stances in this situation. And those strong stances have increased over time. I put it on social media today. The best way to understand this is through the lens of victims and oppressors. Or at least that's the way many on the left want you to understand it. I don't think that's actually the way to understand this. In reality, it's far more complicated, and that's why I'm putting out this episode. I again have on the podcast one of my staff who shall not be named. We'll call him Kevin. He's a real expert on this stuff, so we're going to have a great conversation. We're going to dive into what happened recently, why these rocket attacks are happening, what the conflict actually is right now. But then we're gonna go down a few layers and help you understand the history of this. And it is complicated. I've taken a couple trips to Israel at this point and gotten the best of the best information. And, so I've gotten pretty well read on the issue, and it's still, I still feel like I'm just scratching the surface. And we'll try to scratch that surface a little bit more today. But look, if you wonder why so many of your kind-hearted left-wing friends always seem to take the side of the Palestinians, well, it's because they view everything through the lens of victims and oppressors. There's this belief that Palestinians are eternal victims and that the Israelis are eternal oppressors. Now, this isn't the only place that sort of optic plays out for the left, right? You see it on our border. You had AOC comparing the Israeli-Palestinian situation to the U.S. and our border crisis. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, but it goes to show you how they see things. All right, the BLM riots throughout the entirety of 2020, this was fundamentally about spinning a narrative that there are oppressors and that there are victims, and that you must be in either category. Unless you're on the left, then you get to be the champion of the victims. Now, this makes them feel good. This helps you understand, I think, why this has become so popular on college campuses and in Democrat circles to be cheering for Palestinians. Now, the problem is, again, truth gets in the way of this. And it is not necessarily true that just because you are smaller and weaker, that you have some kind of moral high ground. And that's a really important point, and that's what we're going to unpack, I think, through the rest of this episode. Kevin, thanks for being back on. Can you give us an update on what you're hearing? You follow this stuff really closely. Where are we right now in Israel? This has been going on for 3 days. We'll get to why it started here in a second, but what's the current status out there?
So as of right now, there's been right under 2,000 rockets fired from Gaza into Israel. So that's the main thing that a lot of people are hearing about. So these rockets range from homemade improvised weapons that they take a pipe, attach tail fins, improvise an explosive, and shoot it. These don't have a lot of range. But what's really unique about what's happening now with this current rocket barrage isn't just the intensity of it, but it's some of the armaments that are being used, more advanced rocket systems, not to mention drones. So loitering munitions, as they're called. So what these are is they're kamikaze drones, which are piloted, are able to linger over a target. They're able to be moved by the pilot and strike. So these drones look very similar to an Iranian product that they've been putting out and that they've been sending to their proxies in Yemen, Shia militias in Syria and Iraq. So that's the indirect fire aspects going on. The Israeli response has been to target Hamas leadership, operatives, infrastructure such as rocket launching sites, caches, intelligence facilities. And recently, so that's mainly been done by the IAF, the Israeli Air Force. But last night, the IDF, the ground components, joined in, and they moved to the Gaza border. Now, there was a little bit of some clumsy tweeting, which led a lot of people to think that a ground operation into Gaza had begun. But what's really happened is now it's been opened up with some artillery fire that has been used to target what's called Gaza Metro. So thinking of a metro as an underground tunnel system that you use to get around, that's exactly what it is in Gaza. Except here, it's used for a bit more nefarious purposes.
I read a story. I read a story that sloppy tweeting might have been purposeful, in order to get Hamas leadership to basically sequester themselves into that tunnel system, so that Israelis could more properly strike military targets, those military personnel, as opposed to other places where you might kill more civilians, and then that might have been an information operation intended to do that. I have no idea. Read one story about it. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
No, I mean, I think that's very possible. I mean, things aren't just done by the seat of their pants. Things aren't done without thought. They're usually very good about their plans and how they do it. And then also, when they're done with this operation, they'll go through and they'll do a proper AAR, or they'll do an after-action review, where they go through and look, all right, what was our intent? Did we achieve it? What can we do better? What should we sustain and continue to do? So while it looks sloppy, I wouldn't discount that opinion.
I want to also know just some numbers for people. This is what I have most recently. Hamas has killed 7 Israeli civilians and injured more than 500. I don't have the numbers here on how many Hamas leadership has been killed, and potentially how many civilians have been killed in Gaza. But it's also important to note that about 300 of the rockets that Hamas has launched have fallen within Gaza itself, injuring and killing Gazan civilians. What'll happen oftentimes is they'll blame Israel for that. They'll take a bunch of pictures of it. They'll bring in toys. They'll put them on the scene, and then they'll take pictures of it and send it out. And our wonderful college activists here back in America, they believe it. They take it all in, hook, line, and sinker. It's just important to know these are just strategies. There's plenty of evidence for this, and people have to know this when you're assessing what's going on here. I want also quickly paint a picture geographically for people. When you're looking at Israel, let's see, it's in sort of a, I don't know, like a, what shape would you describe Israel in? It's like a pointy melon kind of. Okay, and on the west side of it, there's the Mediterranean Sea. Gaza is situated in that southwest corner. Okay, it is blocked off. It is like an island within Israel. It's on the coast. It's in that southwest corner. It's important to note that Gaza is run by Hamas, and the West Bank, which is also the Palestinian territory, is separate from that. There's nothing linking these two places. Israel is in between them both. The West Bank is where the Palestinian Authority has control. We're going to get into some internal politics within the Palestinian politics here shortly as well. I think that's also important for people to note. But I just want to paint that picture so people understand what we're talking about when we're talking about Gaza. And also important to note, Lebanon is to the north of Israel, because we're going to talk about what Hezbollah has been doing as well. Hezbollah is the Iranian proxy group that is Lebanese. They are Shia Muslims. That's why they are an Iranian proxy group. And it turns out that Israel's also been taking some rocket fire from Syria, which is also to the north and east of Israel borders. In the Golan, when you hear the Golan Heights, that's their border with Syria. Okay, I hope that pull out a map if you're listening to this podcast and just I think look at it, because it'll just be much easier to follow along. Because I want this to also be a just a good a one-stop shop for a quick everything you need to know about what's going on in Israel right now. Anyway, Kevin, keep going as far as current situation. Anything else to add?
Well, if I could add to what you're talking about, the geography of it. something that's hard for a lot of Americans who haven't been there, and as a Texan especially, that's hard to understand, is how compact it is. So you
That's
can
true.
rent a car at Ben Gurion Airport, which is not dead center, but pretty center of Israel. You drive 2.5 hours, 3 hours to the north, and you can be in Metula, which is on the border with Lebanon, or you could be in the Golan Heights, which is on the border with Syria. You turn in the other direction and you drive south from Ben Gurion again, and within 4 hours, you're down in a lot. If you look to your east, you have Jordan and Saudi Arabia. If you look to your west, you have Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula. So it's a small country, but not just is it a small country, but Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, and Ramallah, where the PA is based, the Palestinian Authority, has their main headquarters. As a crow flies, those are 10 miles apart.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not talking about a huge geographic area. We're talking about somewhere where you can easily get to and from. So,
Yeah.
And you mentioned something else before when you were talking about the Hamas rockets that have fallen within Gaza and that have injured and killed Gazans. Well, 2 of the victims in Israel were Israeli Arabs, were Muslim Israeli Arabs. So Hamas is saying that they're fighting to liberate Muslims. They're fighting to liberate Arabs, but at the same time, they're killing them. So that's an important thing to understand, is that while a lot of times we talk about the battlefield, that's just one of the domains in this fight where the IDF and Hamas will exchange fire. And there it's clear that Israel is far superior. But where there's closer parity is in Hamas's understanding of the media and political aspects of this fight.
Oh, they're
the
amazing
legal
propagandists.
Absolutely.
They're excellent. This is probably a good time to talk about this sort of myth of proportionality before we get to so people who are listening. Let's talk about the myths of a disproportionate response. Then I want to get to the background of this particular situation. Then we'll go into a deeper dive of the history of Israel, how it was formed, and why these basically it's like 6 families that are possibly being evicted in East Jerusalem, and how that supposedly led to this whole thing. But there's a lot more to it than that. But let's talk about this myth of disproportionate response. We were talking about it before the podcast, and I think it's important for people to note, because if you know nothing about warfare, and if you know nothing about tactics, you've never been shot at, it's easy to believe that there's some moral authority granted to someone with less military capability than you. But this isn't true, and we need to think a little bit deeper about this and about what is happening, about who is doing what. And Kevin, like you pointed out something really, really good. It was like, okay, let's take this comment about a disproportionate response to your logical conclusion. If what you're asking for is a proportionate response, then what you're saying is that Israel should just lob about 2,000 rockets in a non-discriminate fashion on Gaza. That would be the proportionate response. Now, of course, they don't do that. They take every possible measure to avoid civilian casualties. And I think it's also worth noting, when you instigate conflict, it's what kind of response might you expect? And that's just brushed over so quickly in liberal media. It's very, very unfair to the situation. Look, we do it here in the United States also. Right, when we're having riots in the streets because there's another police shooting. Before anyone asks what led up to that police shooting, now it doesn't always mean that police shooting or that police action was justified, but at least we should ask the question and try to put yourself in that situation on what you would do. And there just doesn't seem to be a lot of that critical thinking with respect to this situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that comes from a very simplistic understanding or just a pure lack of understanding of proportionality. Because, I guess in a sense it is kind of a term that's more jargon when we're actually talking about law than just when we're using it generally in everyday speech. Because what proportionality actually comes down to is damage versus advantage. So it comes down to, is the amount of damage that this strike will cause acceptable given the military advantage that this would provide? So it's not that simplistic, well, if you shoot at me with a rifle, then I can only shoot at you with a rifle. So there's a lot of pure misunderstandings that need to be corrected on that. And you're exactly right with the if we tease that out to its logical conclusion, that means Israel stops using precision guided munitions.
Yeah.
So
it doesn't, and like we this conversation overseas and our own wars that we fight in Iraq and Afghanistan, clearly in a sense, we're fighting against, like if you want me to use a proportionate response against the Taliban, well, then again, by logical implication, you want me to lay IEDs indiscriminately everywhere. Of course, we're not going to do that. It's just warfare is far more complicated than people realize. And let me add one more thing to the current situation. They're a little bit worried that the Iron Dome is basically a missile interceptor system that tracks incoming rockets and sends up an interceptor and destroys them. Very effective, but there's only so many interceptors available. There is some worry that we might run out in Israel. Do you have any extra comments on that?
Yeah, so the Iron Dome is an amazing piece of technology. I think anybody who's been on social media has probably seen some of the videos of the interceptors going up to destroy these rockets. So it's a lot of people may remember the Patriot missile system and the Gulf War and how those were used to take out Scuds. Iron Dome is like Patriot on steroids for far less money. So it's an actual network that tracks trajectory, speed, point of launch, and so they're able to determine where it will land with that data. And so if it's threatening a population center in Israel, they'll launch one of the Iron Dome interceptors, which I believe each Patriot missile was something in the millions of dollars. Iron Dome is the estimates range $20,000 to $100,000 per interceptor. So there's still an asymmetry when we talk about asymmetry of cost when we talk about improvised rockets.
Yeah.
But that's the extent that they're willing to go to is launch these Iron Dome systems. So with days of sustained rocket fire from Gaza, Israel's having to dip into their supply. So right before we got on this podcast, and I got a tweet notification about missiles fired from Syria. If there's a second front open, like what happened in 2006, when Israel was fighting both Hamas and Hezbollah, that could really strain Israel's supply. And another thing to talk about when we talk about the Israeli response, I'd encourage anybody listening, if you don't have it, you can go to your app store, download Red Alert. So it's an app that a lot of Israelis have on their phone. You set your notifications on, and it will alert you anytime a red alert goes off in the country. So if you just in the comfort of your home here in the United States, and you have that, and you hear it going off pretty much nonstop at times, you can kind of better understand what's happening in Israel. And then you'll also see that the number of rockets shot into Israel, there's actually a lot of patience displayed by the Israelis when they're not in an active barrage.
Yeah, imagine you're in a county like Houston. It's a large county, and imagine our neighboring county is lobbing rockets into us. That's what you're dealing with. In America, we would never let that stand. Well, I don't know. Anything's possible under this administration, but I think generally speaking, we would not let that stand, and we would take care of that problem real quick. Okay, if there was a bunch of rockets being lobbed over from Tijuana or Juarez, you think we would have zero patience for that. The amount of patience so let me say something else real quick. I try to play devil's advocate here. So if there's one of our favorite college activists is still sitting there and listening to this podcast amazingly, and I thank you for it if you are, and you're screaming at your headphones because you're like, no, Dan, I don't mean that by disproportionality. I mean Palestinians are out there protesting, exercising a First Amendment right, and then they just get mowed down by Israeli guards and soldiers. They just get killed. They're just throwing stones and they get killed for it. Now, is this true? I mean, I'm not saying it never has happened, but I don't believe it's true this time. What is the ground truth on this? Is that really happening? And where does this belief come from the American left that this kind of injustice happens all the time?
I wish I had an answer, but I don't have a clue because you can look at even the Palestinian Authority, who's the more quote unquote moderate of the two when you talk about Hamas and Fatah. So even looking at Fatah and the PA compared to Israel. So in 2015 and 2016, some people called it the Ninth Intifada, but there were a bunch of stabbings going on throughout the country. In Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, Taylor Force, a U.S. veteran who was over in Israel studying, and the Taylor Force Act is named after him, which puts much more severe restrictions on U.S. aid to the Palestinian Authority because how they treat their people who kill civilians. If you're a Palestinian and you kill an Israeli civilian, and let's say you go to jail, your family will then get a stipend. That's largely called the pay for slay program, in its colloquial terms. So if you kill someone, we'll pay you for it. And depending on how long you go to jail for, the longer you go, the more we'll pay you. So your family's getting taken care of. And guess what? You may have a street named after you. You may have a square in the town named after you.
Now the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority denies this, right? They say that's a myth and we're just giving people welfare, right? So
that's their argument. But does that create an incentive or a disincentive?
Right. I mean, the fact is whatever you call it, the money's still going there, and it's directly related to this action.
Well, yeah, exactly. And a large part of that is because of and not to get into Palestinian politics just yet, but a major concern that the Palestinians have is the corruption of the PA. But you look at how the Palestinian Authority treats Palestinians who kill Israelis. But then you look on the other side, go back to 2015 and 2016, the Ninth Intifada, which is why I mentioned it. An Israeli soldier in Hebron shot a Palestinian who had been restrained already. And the judges found that this person didn't pose a threat. You illegally killed him. Mm-hmm. So the Israelis will actually enforce the laws of war on their fighters, on the IDF soldiers.
Right.
So, and that's just when we talk about war. Now, if you want to talk about the differences between a Palestinian who lives in Israel, whether it be in Jaffa, Nazareth in the north, and a Palestinian who lives in Ramallah, from what you hear, it's both of them are being persecuted. They don't have rights. There's no freedom. Well, guess what? The Arab, the Palestinian who lives in Jaffa, who lives in Nazareth, they get a vote in regularly scheduled free and fair elections. Mm-hmm. And in Israel with Israeli politics, it's been a lot of elections in the past couple of years, but they get to go vote. They get to go have their voices heard. And guess what? In the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, there are Arab representatives. There are Muslim Arab representatives. On the Israeli Supreme Court, there are Muslim Arabs on the Israeli Supreme Court. There's rule of law in Israel. There's freedom of the press. Now, they're a little bit different, but if you go into the West Bank and Gaza, well, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, he's in the 16th year of his 4-year term. He hasn't held elections because he knew he was going to lose. So you don't get to vote in free and fair elections. I mentioned the major concern in the Palestinian Authority is corruption. Well, there's a lot of corruption because there's no rule of law. It depends on what family you're from, how well connected you are. In Arabic, do you have the wasta? Who do you know? Mm-hmm. There's no free press. If you want to put something out that's opposed to the Palestinian Authority, and God forbid Hamas, because if we want to talk about people killing Gazans, try to be a Palestinian in Gaza who speaks out against Hamas. You're not going to last very long.
No, that ain't going to happen. So let's.
It's kind of nuts when people try to group it all in together because that one line separating them has maybe the Arabs who enjoy the most freedom in the Middle East, in Israel.
Yeah,
versus
it's very possibly true. And it's not to say there's not problems. I mean, like, you know, with some opportunity, especially in East Jerusalem, but there's a lot of amazing, I've traveled there a few times, a lot of amazing groups trying to I would say the problems are similar to problems that you see in a lot of Western countries with downtrodden neighborhoods versus more well-to-do neighborhoods. And, there's more complicated than that. I understand that. But when you compare it to being in the West Bank, as you alluded to, in Ramallah, it's a very, very different place. And it's just not what people think it is. And this podcast is about getting folks to open their minds a little bit to what's really going on. Let's talk about this week's situation. So there's a couple different, I think, sources of conflict here. On the surface, it seems the current round of hostilities goes back to this neighborhood in East Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah, where 6 Palestinian families may be evicted due to a court order. So these families were given their homes by the Jordanian government after 1948, when the families fled their homes during the Israeli War of Independence. Prior to the war, the homes had been owned by Jews. Since 1967, there's been a legal process leading to the current situation, which is now before the Israel Supreme Court. Also happening, but also distinct from what I just said there is probably so confusing if you don't know any history about Israel. We'll try to unpack a little bit of that for you here in a little bit. Distinct from this, but everything's related. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, that's been a scene of violence as Hamas has stoked tensions and Muslims have begun stockpiling weapons in Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's important to note, if you see pictures of Israel and the old city in Jerusalem, you see everybody praying against the Western Wall, that big wall. You've seen our presidents often visit there. This is an extremely holy site. It's called the Temple Mount. It has long been in Jewish history. It has been destroyed multiple times throughout history, and it is the holiest of the holiest places. Now, and the reason there's so much tension there is because there is Al-Aqsa Mosque right on top of the Temple Mount. It was built there on purpose. And so if you understand how long this goes back to, and Kevin, you'll be able to unpack that history just a little bit better than I do. But just laying the groundwork here, a lot of tension there. But they were stockpiling weapons in this mosque. Okay, this mosque is near the big golden dome you see in pictures a lot. That's the Dome of the Rock, also a Muslim holy site. That's not what we're talking about. Al-Aqsa Mosque is near that. Okay, so this leads to Israeli police moving in force to deal with this, I guess, weapons caches, and it leads to violent clashes on the Temple Mount as Palestinians are throwing stones, they're shooting fireworks, and Israeli police attempt to disperse the crowds with tear gas. Okay, that's what. There's no shooting going on. All right, it's tear. I believe that looks like a proportional response. Violence has come to a high point as Muslims are concluding their celebration of the Night of Power. So it is Ramadan, marking the day the Quran was revealed to Muhammad. And at the same time, you got below the Temple Mount on the Western Wall. Again, it's below the Temple Mount because that's as close as Jews can get to their holy site, because the top of it is only for Muslims. So below the Temple Mount at the Western Wall, Israelis, mostly the Orthodox religious Zionists, they began celebrating their Jerusalem Day. This is when Jerusalem was reunited in 1967. A lot of history behind that. So between the evictions, between these other outbursts, you see this escalation happening. Hamas issues an ultimatum, says Israel needs to withdraw by a certain time, or it's going to begin a rocket barrage. Withdraw from where, Kevin? What exactly were they demanding? Withdraw from the Temple Mount?
Yeah, they were demanding that Israeli police move off the Temple Mount. Because, sorry, to add another layer of complexity to this, and there's already been a lot of dates, but so in 1967, when Jerusalem was reunited, which is what the Israelis at the Western Wall were celebrating, there was a lot of Moshe Dayan, the Minister of Defense.
The guy with the eye patch.
Exactly. He didn't really know what to do with
quick story. So a couple times ago, I was in Israel, and it was Purim. Purim is a holiday that looks a lot like Halloween. Now it is a religious holiday. I asked one of my Jewish friends at the time, what does Purim mean? Why do you celebrate it? He's like, Like most of our celebrations, it's a time when everybody tried to kill us and we survived, so we celebrate. Okay, got it. That's basically every Jewish holiday. So I just wore an eye patch to try it because I didn't have a costume or anything. It looks like Halloween, and everybody's like, Moshe Dayan, got it. And I was like, this is perfect. I'm the old Minister of Defense for Israel. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah. So Moshe Dayan, he didn't really want the Temple Mount to be taken because it would create political constraints and political problems because he recognized how holy it was. So when the Temple Mount was taken, and he arrived on scene, he tried to diffuse the situation to make it known, like, look, we're not conquering this, as we're not turning this from a Jewish site into a Jewish site from an Islamic site. The Israeli Knesset, within I think 2 months, passed a law to respect the holy places, and so even though it was under their military power, the state of Israel never kicked Muslims off. In fact, they allowed the Temple Mount to continue to be administered by the Islamic Waqf. That's like a charitable trust, which is funded by the Jordanians. So you can go onto the Temple Mount if you're Christian or if you're Jewish, but you cannot pray on the Temple Mount. So Israel is responsible for the security of the Temple Mount, but the actual administration day to day is by the Islamic Waqf, and they've been known to, if a Jew is on the Temple Mount and closes his eyes and they think he's mumbling a prayer, they'll kick him off. Mm-hmm. If you're a Christian and you bring your Bible, you open it up, they'll kick you off. If you're thumbing your rosary beads, they'll kick you off. So when it comes to terms of worship, it's purely an Islamic site. So that's what's unique about it. So Hamas's demand was that Israel stop ensuring security on the Temple Mount. So they make that ultimatum. But in the days leading up to the outburst of violence, more than normal, people on the Temple Mount during Ramadan, as the Night of Power and Eid approached, were forming into groups with Hamas flags and chanting anti-Israel, pro-Hamas slogans and trying to rile people up. And they were largely successful.
And this is part of the propaganda techniques that are used. Look, instigate some kind of conflict, get it going, knowing full well that on the world stage you can make yourself look like the victim. I mean, they've got this down to a science. I mean, I mentioned before they're how quick they are with social media, bringing toys to bombing sites. They've done this in the past. I don't know if they've done it this time, but it is a tactic used. They're experts at this, and maybe at this point too we go backwards in time. Let's unpack this whole story with 6 Palestinian families being evicted due to a court order. So the families were given the homes by the Jordanian government after 1948. So what happened in 1948? Well, this was the time period where the British decided to pull out of what was then called Palestine and agreed to give the Jews a homeland. Right? Is that the correct technical way to say what was happening there?
Yeah. So it's a little bit complicated. So
everything is with this.
Of course. So prior to 1948, the British government expressed support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The British. This was during World War I, when the Jews were aligning with some Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula, and it was all to fight the Ottomans. So I won't go too far back and delve too deep into that. But after the war and the Ottomans lost, the British had control of mandatory Palestine. They ended up splitting off what is now Jordan to become a purely Arab state. As the British Empire started declining, World War II comes about. Britain was trying to look for a way to extract itself from its colonial holdings and empire. So during this time, you had a lot of you had the creation of a Zionist movement. where European Jews were looking to get out of Europe, to go to a place where they could be Jews and not suffer persecution. A lot of it was spurred on by the Dreyfus Affair, a whole thing about a Jewish French general who was accused of treason for nothing other than being Jewish. So this was even pre-Holocaust. So you had a lot of inflow of European Jews into mandatory Palestine. As the British were trying to figure out what to do and to leave, when they decided to leave, they're like, all right, how do we do this in a delicate way?
Real quick, it's important to note people have this idea that it's during World War II you have millions of Jews all of a sudden appearing in a Palestinian homeland. This is not the case. This for a long time, Jewish families have been moving into this territory, and this is a very, very gradual process that basically just came to a head in 1948.
Yeah, absolutely. So in fact, the British actually did not allow European Jews who had just been freed from concentration camps to enter into mandatory Palestine. They redirected boats to I forget if it was Cyprus or Crete, and put them in refugee holding camps. And that's because they didn't want the balance in the land to be too askew. So there had been some recommendations that, look, the populations need to be separated, land swaps, trade. The British really didn't come to a solution. Who came to a solution was the UN. The UN voted in favor of creating a Jewish homeland and an Arab homeland. So leading up to this vote, there was a bit of a civil war with Arabs and Jews fighting each other in what is now Israel. After the vote, and actually today, May 14th, 1948, is the day that Israel declared, well, today's not May 14th, 1948, but on May 14th, 1948, that's when Israel actually declared its independence by the Jewish calendar, or by the Western calendar. So after Israel declared its independence, full-fledged war broke out. This new country that just said, we are our own thing now, was then attacked by Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. Iraqi soldiers came. So you had this small new country, that was facing the weight of the Arab world. So as this happened, you had a lot of populations. So when the UN said this will be Israeli, or this will be Jewish, this will be Arab, those areas weren't exclusively Arab or weren't exclusively Jewish. So you had a lot of people start moving into the areas that were going to be quote unquote theirs. Well, then with the breakout of a full-fledged war, you had people fleeing war, which is what people do if you're not fighting.
Right.
So you had a lot of population movement. You had a lot of displaced people, and it was going in both directions.
Yeah.
So
and that's interesting, and it's important to note that's what people mean by the refugee camps. So when people talk about the refugee camps in the West Bank, by the way, when you go to these aren't camps by any stretch; they're just neighborhoods. And what they're referring to is people who left their homes after that conflict in 1948. These are descendants of them. That's what they mean by refugees. Okay, and it's just you can still have an opinion one way or the other on what that means, but I just want to paint the right picture for people on what they mean by, because you hear the word refugee and you think tent city. You think these people were just displaced as their homes were bulldozed 5 months ago by Israeli bulldozers. It's just not true. And but that's the picture painted. And I bet if I asked your average college activist, that's what they would think is true, but it's not true.
Yeah, absolutely. They may have started off as camp, but they are full. They're cities. Unless you were told, or unless you see the UNRWA, the signage that the UN puts up for their refugee works agency,
right?
You wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
Right. I've driven through these places.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and what's interesting is that and sorry, not to sidetrack too much, but on the other side of that refugee coin are the millions of Jews who had to leave the Arab world,
right,
to come to Israel. So Baghdad. Huge Jewish population. Some people say it was up to a third of the population of Baghdad was Jewish. They had to get up and leave and come to Israel. So there's two sides to the refugee argument, but not to get too off topic. But yeah, so when the war broke out, a Jewish family, or 6 Jewish families, who were living in these homes that are now at the center of this legal battle. Sheikh Jarrah was not going to be an Israeli-controlled territory, so they left. There were 6 Arab families who left what was going to be in Israel. They came to the West Bank, which after the war, the West Bank, as we know it, was under Jordanian control. So these families came, and the Jordanians put them up in these houses. So you had 6 families in these houses, which up to then had been bought and paid for by Jewish families. That's 1948. You fast forward to 1967, and the Six-Day War happens. Israel takes full control of the West Bank to include East Jerusalem, and now they are back in control of these 6 houses.
Let's rewind a little bit. So the Six-Day War happens because everybody decides to invade Israel. Right?
Yeah. So,
it's important to know because this story was being told on the New York Times podcast today, and they just brush right past the fact that the Arab world was trying to destroy Israel during this time, and that's why there was a war in the first place, and that's why they had that. That's why this basically redrawing of lines occurred. It just goes to show how dishonest our mainstream media is about this and why so many Americans are so deeply misinformed about it. But anyway, yeah, continue. So the Six-Day War happens.
Yeah, and they'll also say, well, it was a preemptive strike, which is true. Israeli intelligence was seeing the Egyptians, the Syrians, and the Jordanians were massing their forces. And they were intercepting signals intelligence talking about the plans for battle. And so Israel decided, all right, before they can put their planes in the air and establish air dominance, we're going to take their planes off the chessboard. And so they knew that they were going to be attacked, and rather than sitting back and waiting, they acted because the survival of the state was on the line. So they attacked, they won. The West Bank, East Jerusalem, it was now under Israeli control, Israeli administration. There's a lot of discussion. How do we deal with this? What do we do? Do we give it back? Do we keep it? Do we establish full control? Do we annex it? Well, you have this issue of these 6 houses. So the Jewish families who live there, now they could actually have a legal recourse. So they started legal proceedings. I don't know if it was 1967 or 68, but it was around the time that they actually could start legal proceedings. Well,
interesting.
2021.
So Jewish families started the legal proceedings. The Jewish families who owned those 6 houses before, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Just make sure it's all clear.
It's been a long legal battle, which is now pending before the Supreme Court of Israel. So they're trying to stoke up this Save Sheikh Jarrah, like it's a huge, wide scale evictions and repopulation. So there's a bit more to it than just the hashtag.
Yeah, well, there's I guess in the worst case scenario for Palestinians and Arabs living in East Jerusalem, this would set legal precedent for any Jewish descendants who used to be in those homes to now be able to take them over, right? Would that be the argument?
Well, and there's also some concern on the Israeli side that this could set a precedent for
the opposite.
Arabs to retake their homes.
Right.
So that's why it's a very unique and it's a very complex situation with a lot of.
Have they decided to evict these Palestinian families yet, or no? That's still not decided.
No, it's still pending.
Okay. And that Supreme Court decision has not taken place yet.
Not to my knowledge. No.
Okay.
So it's still something that's in the works. It's still something that may be happening. So that people are pointing to that as the catalyst. But really going back to people using that and then Hamas stoking the riot and the demonstrations on the Temple Mount. And I said Hamas doesn't usually do that. They do have a presence. They will be active, but the degree to which they were active was unique. So I would say actually that the reason that what's happening right now with Hamas is because of what happened on April 30th, when the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas declared that the parliamentary and presidential elections, which were set for later this month, are going to yet again be delayed. This is the same Mahmoud Abbas, who, as I said earlier, is 16 years into a 4-year term.
Mm-hmm.
So Hamas, I believe, is looking at this through electoral terms, because polling of Palestinians shows that if Hamas tries to hang on to power, it could bode well for the political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh. So it's all electoral, or at least a large component of it is electoral. Hamas is looking at this and saying, I can appear tough. I can appear to stand up to the Israelis, and I can win Palestinian votes by killing Israelis.
Yeah, and that's another thing people don't understand about this dynamic. There are these two factions within the Palestinian people. Hamas, which is an outright terrorist organization, has lots of support from Iran. I think we should move on to how Iran fits into all this here in a minute. And then you have the Palestinian Authority. I think that the Palestinian Authority is what people generally recognize as sort of a somewhat more legitimate government of Palestine, Mahmoud Abbas, and before him, why is his name escaping me? Yasser Arafat, right? I'm sure everybody would recognize that figure if you saw him. Part of the famous Camp David peace accord. All of these peace accords that ended up really going nowhere. That might be a whole different podcast on how you actually solve this problem, whether it's a 1-state or 2-state solution or status quo, whatever it is. But what is interesting about these, let me pause there. The one question I have for you, Kevin, maybe you have the answer to this, is polling amongst Palestinian people. How do they generally feel? Are they pretty? Are they susceptible to the Hamas argument that the only way is to fight and exterminate the Jewish homeland, or is there a growing number that are sick of it and want some kind of peace? Is it split? What's your take on that?
So it fluctuates. I've been watching. I look at occasionally a certain site, Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, and they do topical polls. So the poll that I'm looking at, the most recent poll that's up is from March, and it's asking about the May election. So back in 2015 and 2016, when the knife intifada, when these stabbing attacks were occurring, they would poll Palestinians on, is this legitimate? Is this just? Is this right? So what you generally see in the Palestinian electorate, and I'm not an expert here by any means, I just kind of look at polls now and then and try to pay a little bit more attention than most people. But I think what you see is you have the hardcore all Hamas wing, all Hamas, never Fatah, if you will. Mm-hmm. And they are 100% in. I don't want to assign a numerical value to it. But then on the other side, you have the never Hamas, Fatah wing, who are largely people who benefit from the current situation. Because you mentioned going up to Ramallah and actually seeing the reality. There's quite a few mansions and villas.
Yeah. People should understand that. In the West Bank, I was there. I wasn't sure what to expect, to be honest. And what's interesting, by the way, is Israelis need very, very special permission to get into the West Bank. It's very rare. There are some groups, for us, some members of Congress, but I also went when I was at Harvard. And to me, just having spent a lot of time in the Middle East, it just looked like another Middle Eastern city. It wasn't, I guess, what people imagine. Again, everything needs to be observed in context, and I happen to have a lot of perspective in context because I've spent so much time all over the Middle East. I know what normal looks like. This looks very normal to me. There's a lot of trash everywhere. They don't clean it up. And there's a lot of mansions. There's a lot of nice cars, and there's a lot of poverty. It's it's a typical Middle Eastern city. So important for people to know. We ate at restaurants. Like, there's normal restaurants. There's places to shop. It's
there's
not
a KFC in Ramallah.
Yeah,
like Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Yeah,
it's not uncommon. Yeah,
right. There's a lot of things like that that your Western eyes would recognize. So, just trying to paint a picture here. for people. But I interrupted you. What were you going with that thought? Or did?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, like everything, you have people on the extremes, the people who benefit from the status quo of the trade. And then this goes back to the corruption issue in Palestinian politics. And then you've got a lot of people who in the middle who it fluctuates. It varies a lot. So
let's move on.
Yeah.
Let's move on to Iran. So one of the key trademarks of the Trump, let's talk geopolitics for a second here. So under the Trump administration, gets no credit for this, but massive successes when it comes to the so-called unattainable peace in the Middle East. And what do people mean by peace in the Middle East? Look, I don't think we got peace in the Middle East, obviously. Usually what people mean by that is some kind of accord between the Palestinians and the Israelis. We haven't gotten that yet. But what the Trump administration did get, which is amazing, was various peace accords between Arab states and Israel. This was always thought to be totally impossible. And turns out it's not, because look, and as I put it on social media today, not even the Arabs buy this oppressor victim narrative anymore. They don't. Look, behind closed doors, they really never have. But now they're saying it openly. And part of the reason was twofold. One, the United States under President Trump finally took a very clear position. Very clear positions are very useful in geopolitics. And he took a very clear one here, a pro-Israeli stance. We're not going to put up with the lies that the Palestinian Authority is putting forth, that Hamas is putting forth. We're not going to put up with it anymore. We're also going to take a very hard stance against Iran. We're not giving an inch anymore. Okay, that's very clear. It sends a very clear signal. Now, keep in mind that the general conflict in the Middle East is between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Okay, Shia represented by these are just different sects of Islam. I think it's derived from descendants of Muhammad and who's not a descendant of Muhammad. That's basically the division. Maybe some other things. It doesn't make a lot of sense to Westerners, but look, it means a lot to Muslims. And Shia Islam is represented by Iran for the most part. Sunni Islam is represented by Saudi Arabia. This is why these two are foes in a geopolitical sense. All other Arab states are Sunni, except for Lebanon is very mixed. And
Iraq is majority Shia.
Iraq is majority Shia, but Al-Anbar province in the west is all Sunni. But yeah, the population centers in the east are all Shia. So, but for them, all the Gulf Arab states, all the rich oil states, those are all Sunni. Yemen is mostly Sunni, but there's the Houthi rebels. Iran supports them. They're Shia. Anyway, the point is that this is how this conflict always materializes. So, Iran is incredibly skilled at supporting surrogates in their type of warfare, and then their type of, let's call them asymmetric operations. They're very good at this, and they do it all over the region. And when they're told, and look, we saw this after the first time President Obama signed the JCPOA, which is the Iran nuclear deal. And immediately what was happening was additional funding towards the Al-Quds Force, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC. This is their special operations units, okay? And they're very good at surrogate warfare. And those surrogates all over the region are run by these units. So a lot of funding went there. That means a lot of funding to Hamas. Now, Hamas is Sunni, but it fits the geopolitical purposes of Iran, because Iran hates the Jews the most, right? They hate Sunnis, but they really hate the Jews. And so the enemy of your enemy is your friend, I guess. Or did I say that right? You know what I mean. So they support Hamas via rockets. Kevin, you were noting that earlier with the drones, these high-priced drones, which we've seen throughout the region. These clearly have ties to Iran. Iran's other probably major and most capable force is Hezbollah. So that's the Shia Muslim group within Lebanon. Lebanon is split between Christian groups, Hezbollah, and Sunni, right? That's and then I suppose some secular society. Lebanon's a whole other podcast. But it matters for the sake of the conversation about Israel, because Hezbollah's strongholds are in the south of Lebanon, right on the border with Israel, and Hezbollah hates Israelis and hates Jews. So that's just painting the picture here real quick in the Middle East. And my point is this: when you start talking about removing sanctions from Iran, you embolden them, and you encourage them to start spending money that they thought they wouldn't have earlier, but now they think they will have it, and they start becoming emboldened. They don't think that the Biden administration is going to be hard on them. They don't think that that Biden would ever order a strike on Soleimani and re-invoke that sense of deterrence. Remember, we talked about this at length. Who knows? Like a year and a half ago, was that when that happened? The reason I was so in favor of that was because we reestablished deterrence. And in a sense, that's what Israel has to do on a daily basis, is reestablish some sense of deterrence and escalation dominance, that gets back into a more honest discussion about proportionality. That's what's happening with Iran right now. They're becoming more emboldened. They're sending weapons everywhere. Again, they send them through their surrogate network. They send them in these basically little fishing vessels all over the place. And I remember trying to track these. So you have anything to add to that? That I tried to paint the broad strokes there. I bet you found a few things you'd want to comment on.
Yeah. So you mentioned Iran sending armament. So I think it was earlier this week, video from the Fifth Fleet of a ship. They were doing a flag check, and they literally found a boatload of weapons. We're talking about small arms, rockets that were going to the Houthis. But another interesting thing that a lot of people don't understand too is that when Iran in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution, prior to that, Iran was an ally of the U.S. and Israel, even. So they had a bunch of our F-16s, F-4s. They had a bunch of our armaments. Well, after 1979, and these are things that we sold to them that as allies, as partners, that's what we did. Well, after 1979 and sanctions, we cut them off. So a lot of advanced technology needs maintenance. So tapping into the human capital of the Persian people, the Iranian regime figured out how to reverse engineer a lot of these things. So they had to figure out how to build the equipment that actually keeps F-16s from 1979 still in the air today. So I say that to say that in a place like Gaza, when we talked about the blockade, well, how do they get this stuff in? Well, it's pretty difficult, but that knowledge that Iran has of how to fabricate and manufacture your own weapons, now instead of having to send these drones, they send schematics.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've seen that in our own wars too. I mean, with the EFPs.
Yep.
Basically, what is it? Explosively formed penetrators. It's very easy once you understand the physics behind it. Very easy to do in some maintenance shop in Iraq, because you're basically just molding a copper plate in a certain way, putting some homemade explosives behind it, and boom, that thing can punch a hole through a armored truck. Same with the IEDs.
Exactly.
The dirt farmers, Taliban in Afghanistan weren't going to figure that out, but Iranians did. And once they have that schematic, they can make some pretty interesting IEDs. Not just kind of one that blew me up, but one of the things we were afraid of was they had photosensitive IEDs at some point in Afghanistan, probably still do. So, but also very rudimentary technology. It's just really not as advanced as it sounds. But basically, you find it, and you might find it through a variety of tactics that we have. But as you brush away the dirt, that's what you do if you want to uncover it and disarm it. As soon as light hits it, it blows up. These things were really screwed up stuff. I mean, that's just nasty armaments, but also very simple. And that kind of know-how comes from Iran.
Well, and that's to their huge advantage. We talked about the cost asymmetries between the Hamas rockets and the Iron Dome interceptors. Well, Iran, they're minimizing their costs even further when they're able to just give schematics and say, go build it. So when it comes to financially, this is a win-win for Iran. And I think in no small part that the reason that they do it this way is because of things like the maximum pressure campaign, where we turned the screws on the Iranian regime. Because in 2015, when the assets were unfrozen, Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they just had an influx of money coming in that, they weren't using it for social services.
No. I mean, we intercepted conversations on that. I mean, we absolutely know what they were using money for, and that's why, look, as a Republican, it's not just that we're just anti things that Obama did. That's not actually how conservatives think, believe it or not. I think it is how Democrats think, unfortunately. But no, we have very good reasons for being against this. And you talk to most people in the Middle East who are allies of ours, and they don't understand what on earth we're thinking with potentially another JCPOA or bringing Iran back to the table. It just removes our leverage to such an insane extent. That deal does. It sets us. It was kind of an immediate gratification, right? Prevent them from immediately sprinting to a bomb right then and there, but almost ensuring that they get it in a legal way years down the road. That's how I would describe it in a nutshell what the JCPOA did, because you have to remember the Iranians and the Chinese and the Russians, they're much more long-term thinkers than we are, because they don't really care about those pesky elections. We unfortunately think in terms of elections and timeframes such as that, which, look, is good, I think, for our longevity. I think it's the right thing to do. But we have a disadvantage sometimes in terms of thinking strategically in the long term, and this is one of those. I think Obama was looking for a political win, and wasn't good for American safety, wasn't good for the region's safety, that's for sure. And what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is what Trump did, and I think proved actually works, which is hard deterrence. Yeah, you guys can run to a bomb if you want, but you won't be around much longer if you do. There, end of discussion. Like it, and that was just never obvious from the Obama administration. Trump made that very obvious, and it turns out deterrence works. It doesn't work with totally crazy people, but the Iranians are not crazy people. It also helps us. It also helps us dealing with Iran to know that the Iranian people are really sick of their regime. See, a second ago we were talking about what do Palestinians think of this. Well, they're a little bit more split. You talk to Iranian, there's a lot, in Houston in particular, there's a lot of Iranian Americans. And there is an overwhelming sense that the regime does not have support, and that simple moral support by the United States is everything to them, and could lead to one day a country that could be one of our best allies. I mean, it's actually possible because the infection from the regime of Iran, it doesn't seem to have infected the people itself, if that makes sense. You Americans don't quite understand. You probably have a lot more in common with Iranians than you might realize. So what else do we want to talk about? We've gone on for a while here. And I think that's a pretty good Middle East conflict 101.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because we could talk for another couple hours, but for your sake, so you don't have to hear me, and then for the listener's sake, it might be best to maybe break it up a little bit. Yeah.
Maybe we'll get back to this. Well, thanks for coming on, and hope that left people slightly less confused about what's going on out there. But appreciate y'all listening. We'll be back next time.